usually per year you have 1 in 3 patients dropping out. And this really means those people, they just go blind. So they don't get treated anymore and they have permanent vision loss. So we really turn this head over heels and say, okay, now it's prospectively, we can predict, not exactly, but we can say in which direction it's going and heading. But for the last 15, 20 years, there is not a single drug that has shown any superiority in their approval trial.
One in 3 patients drop out of treatment every year. They just go blind. Manuel Opitz, co-founder and CEO of DeepEye, and his team saw that gap in ophthalmology, where doctors had no way to predict how patients would respond to treatment until weeks after it was already given. His team built an AI that changes the equation. Predict treatment response before the next injection. No more 6-week waiting periods, no more trial and error. But here's what most people miss. The breakthrough isn't just reading the image, it's knowing what the image means for the next 6 months of someone's vision. In this episode, we talk about building the first predictive AI approved in ophthalmology, navigating the reimbursement landscape that most AI companies ignore, and how Manuel plans to preserve 1 million people from blindness by 2030. Let's get into it. Welcome to Stories in Life Sciences podcast today. I'm excited to learn more about your journey and hear more about DeepEye. And I feel like you guys are really relevant in AI right now in ophthalmology and actually have a pathway to reimbursement. So I'm really excited to hear more about your story and what you got going on there. So welcome. Where are you calling in from today?
Yeah, first, thanks for having me, Christopher. I'm calling in, maybe it's visible here on the side. It's nighttime, so I'm based in Munich, Germany, which is long distance from where you're based right now, Christopher.
Yeah, I'm out on the West Coast here. So yeah, I appreciate you taking the time in the evening. I know as CEO of a startup, I'm sure you're juggling a lot. So actually, this might be a time that worked out for you better in the evening.
Yes, absolutely.
I'm sure you got a lot happening during the day. So just to start off with, Manuel, just tell a little bit more. I know you started off engineering, then business school, and then into the startup world, and just you've had a journey before you got here to DeepEye. So you want to dive in a little bit to that?
Absolutely. So I always like to tell in my heart, I'm still an engineer, and I was trained as a biomedical engineer, my bachelor's and master's, which I did in Germany, Ireland, and Switzerland mostly. And afterwards, I did a typical corporate career start, but quickly found out that it's not really built for me to be in a corporate environment, and decided to do an MBA program and then switched to the dark side, as I always say, so to the commercial and sales side of technical products. And I did so by joining a startup here in Munich. That's when I came here, I think 11 years ago now. And that was in the IP space, but I was focused on medical technology, of course. I went on then to work for some other startups and in the end founded a startup in the orthopedic space, some consulting for a radiology startup. And now for the last 4 years, I've been in an ophthalmology startup, which is called DeepEye, and that we will, of course, touch upon a bit more today.
Why is it the dark side? Why is commercialization? Is that known in the engineering world that like if you enter the commercial side, like you've left your people behind?
I don't know. It's for me in the beginning was also very difficult. You deal less with numbers. Of course, I mean, salespeople, they're all about numbers and looking at sales funnels and velocities. But let's say the math is very simple in sales compared to what we have been doing on the engineering side. I think it's something that for me only came out after or during my studies and then doing different internships, working for different companies in Europe, in China for some time, how important it is actually in the end to explain and sell the technology that you have. I mean, the best product is worthless if it's too difficult for the user to understand in any kind of context. And I'm always focused on the B2B context. So there, especially for professional users, I mean, you can only go as far. So I think this is really something that has driven me forward over the last years to become some kind of translator of those breakthrough possible innovations to the users, but also within the teams. You have the commercial people on the one side and then maybe the regulatory people on the other side who are looking at very different aspects. And then you have maybe the medical doctors, and on the other side, you have your developers. And in the end, all of them need to understand each other. So being a translator, that's basically my day-to-day job as a CEO.
No, I like that. When we first spoke, that's what grabbed my attention. You're that intermediary. I found that's kind of what it was like being in biodesign, is where they connect,
Mm-hmm.
a
Mm-hmm.
clinician, an engineer, and a business person. And it seems like you have the ability to kind of touch into all those segments uniquely, which is super helpful. I feel like in your space, having that background. And any challenges for you from making that transition from like the engineering to the business, like commercial side?
I guess one of the biggest learnings you have very early on, especially then when I founded my first startup, is really that you have to understand, people are not like in engineering a technology, a technology, either it works or not. On the other side, I've experienced that I'm actually much less patient with technology compared to with people. I mean, with people, you really have the beauty that you can learn from them, and maybe you also support them in a job. And when they really, strive and grow and blossom in your company, it's something really amazing that you could never achieve on your own. Well, with the technology, I mean, you set up a process and it can work. And if it fails, you did something wrong in your programming or setup. So it's really different and something which I enjoy much more by now. So it's a very long time ago since I wrote my last line of code or put my last calculation into place.
Manuel, it's like I feel like you're like a unicorn. That's what I would call them at my old company in med tech, where a lot of the engineers sometimes struggle to make that transition. But you've got a unique ability to understand that aspect of it, but still like have the personality side, which I'm sure has helped you really well in your role now. So, on that note, just to dig a little bit more into Deep Eye, what's the problem that you feel like when someone asks you, "What are you solving?" or "What's the biggest problem that you're solving?" and just what a little bit behind the history of like what brought Deep Eye to market. I think you've been there for about 4.5 years now, but just kind of some of the story behind it and where you're at now and what you're solving.
So as in my previous startup, there were some doctors. They had a problem which they faced in their daily routine work. And they, however, were also kind of tinker doctors. So they like to actually try to fix their own problems. They got external help, like some AI consultants, and they built some kind of prototype. And at some point of time, however, you have to decide, do you want to bring this now as a commercial product to the market, which requires regulatory approval so that you can use it on patients? You have to build a team around it to do the distribution. And you, of course, have to integrate it into all different kinds of clinical setups. And that's usually where I really like to join and support those journeys. In the beginning, this was here as a consultant, but I had a couple of other projects running at the same time. But this project turned out to be so interesting, I decided to drop all other projects and join 100%. And those medical doctors, they started actually out in 2010, 11 to do first kind of telemedicine. I mean, back then the word telemedicine didn't exist. So they said they built up a portal to support other resident ophthalmologists in their work. And they started out with like 10, 15, 20. And by now it's almost 70 resident eye doctors in a rural northwest of Germany, which they support using this portal or nowadays telemedicine. And this has really grown, but at some point of time, it wasn't scalable anymore. And they decided we now need technology to really support us. I mean, every day we get hundreds of images to review. We have internal imaging, but we also get these external images. How can we support and better make this process more efficient? And AI for them was a solution which they thought about in 2018. They started to develop a prototype together with a professor or two professors for AI that supported them in their journey. And by 2021, they had developed this first prototype. They had won the German AI Award, which is one of the, or if not the most known award in this space. That was really the time when they thought about the spin out and when they came into contact with me and our CTO co-founder who brought the expertise on building the software infrastructure to embed this AI into the clinical workflows.
Wow. So it's had a long history of coming to this place to market. So yeah, in that amount of time frame though, from 2021 when they made the decision to commercialize, were you on board at that point in time?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I supported them in writing the business plan and, as I said, kind of jumped on board to also co-found the company in late 2021. The first year was still, a lot of pivoting and trial and error. However, we had very early traction, were profitable with a nice digit revenue, just being two people in the company, basically the CTO and myself. And we had a lot of external development support, however, from very experienced AI consultants. One of them we hired as our first employee back then at end of 2021. And that's basically when we also started to really build a startup, end of 2022.
And then what is the biggest problem that you feel like they are solving with this AI imaging? I know that for them specifically within telemedicine, but now like where you see it at when you go into clinicians that are using this software and technology, what are they really solving for them in the clinic?
So I've been before in other medical specialties, as well as my co-founder. And so in radiology or mammography, it's quite standard nowadays to have a second reading before you do an intervention, maybe even a third reading. And there are some AIs being developed or even on the market already that are exactly fulfilling such functions, that they basically check in the background for subtle markers in imaging to tell doctors before they do an intervention on maybe how to best treat this patient. In ophthalmology, this is non-existent. We see that in randomized controlled clinical trials for new drugs, there is always a reading center involved. So they basically provide, you can say, ground truths and review the imaging, but it's only done, let's say, retrospectively when the treatment already has been dished out. This is really where, our co-founding doctors have changed the game by providing a human second opinion to lots of doctors in their area. And they could show that by providing a second opinion, they could actually triple the vision outcomes compared to the German average. And they could also double the adherence and persistence rate. So they really could reduce the number of dropouts. And these numbers are actually on par with what you see usually only in randomized controlled trials, but not in real world studies.
So yeah, that's what I was seeing is there's with these protocols, once they develop a protocol, depending on the patient, oftentimes there's so many dropouts, like they aren't adhering to these protocols. And how does your technology specifically help with that adherence to that?
So in the beginning, the biggest lever for the adherence is, first of all, that the patients are happy with their vision outcomes. And
that helps.
It does. It sounds simple, but to be quite honest, most studies don't even look at that. So our co-founders did lots of studies in their own portal. Some of those studies, 2,500 people over 2 years, really long follow-up studies. And they also really measure now for 10 years dropout rates. Most people, if you ask them in their clinic, they don't know the dropout rate. They say, well, it's relatively low. But if they actually look at the numbers and, across all studies, North America, in Europe, especially Germany, you see usually per year you have 1 in 3 patients dropping out. There are some extreme studies saying 1 in 2 patients in the first year, later than maybe slightly less. And there are some other studies showing maybe 25% dropout rates, but it's usually in the ballpark of 1 in 3 patients dropping out. And this really means those people, they just go blind. So they don't get treated anymore and they have permanent vision loss. And that's, of course, the biggest problem, which you don't want to have as a doctor, as a patient, of course, as well, but also for the healthcare system. For the payers, they're paying a lot for those costly treatments. This can be around 10,000 euros per year to get those eye injections. And then suddenly, the treatment stops and the patient still goes blind, despite being, let's say, on treatment for 1 or 2 years. On average, those patients are, of course, already retirees, so 75, 78 years old. But there are some conditions which are also induced by diabetes, and those patients can even be working age, like 60, 65, 55 years old. So it's a very long time, actually, then to have permanent vision loss. And therefore, the impact on the overall healthcare system is enormous. And this is also why over the last 20 years, basically, this treatment pathway has grown from literally zero to more than 20 billion in treatment costs every year.
Wow. So it feels like you're hitting all the different aspects, like the patients are happier and also the system isn't having, from an economics perspective, I would think that why maybe help to get reimbursement is they're more than happy to pay for something that's going to limit the impact of patients going blind, which is then going to cost the system a lot of money in the long run.
100%. And I mean, there are a lot of discussions because it's a really costly treatment. I mean, it's the single largest cost in the Medicare Part B budget. There are estimations from 2, 3 years ago that said around 12% of the Medicare Part B budget is spent on anti-VEGFs. So it's more costly, those eye injections, than any single cancer drug. And this means it has a huge budget impact. But as you say, the consequences are so dire. The estimations are usually around 2.5 to 3x. So somebody being in treatment is still 2.5 to 3 times cheaper than somebody with visual impairment, not even talking about legal blindness. Payback is definitely there. And we all, of course, want to keep the vision. I have 3 cases in my family, which I only discovered after starting Deep Eye. And so I know very well how it is, the burden also for the patients to drive every 1 or 2 months to see their doctor, get an injection into the eye. But the advantage they gain from it by having stable vision, if the treatment works for the rest of their life, for the rest of the 10, 15 years they still have to live, that's amazing.
Yeah, that is. And it seems like your technology is doing more than just addressing like the imaging and giving a second opinion there. It's more than that with helping to adherence to protocol.
The second opinion, this is, let's say, the classical approach, and we provide, subtle markers we can basically highlight and show to doctors. Maybe, in the rush of the daily clinic, seeing 40, 50 of those patients in the morning. I mean, this is a typical number, that they don't overlook it and that they potentially change their opinion. This leads them to a better outcome and also to a patient who is more likely to stay on treatment. In addition, we also provide, and this is something which no human can see in those images, you can detect subtle markers like, for instance, for the gender, or if somebody's a smoker, or roughly determine even the age. For the doctor, that's not interesting. It's all there. They just have to ask the patient. But what's interesting for the doctor is to know how will this specific patient in front of me react to the treatment. And this is something right now nobody can tell. So our AI, for the first time ever, can predict the treatment response of the individual patient, meaning you can roughly know in which direction the patient is going. Is it a good or a bad responder? A good responder means somebody that can slowly be extended out to only come in every 2, 3, maybe even only every 4 months, reducing drastically the burden for himself or herself, as well as for the system. But there are also other patients, and you can't tell the difference from the outside, that really have to come on every 4, 6, or 8 weeks. And we really can show in advance how this is going to go, in which direction. And this really helps the doctors to find much faster the optimal point of treatment. And in addition, also know when this optimal point in treatment changes, because it's not unusual that after 2 years, patient seems relatively stable, coming every 8 weeks. Suddenly you have reoccurrence of bleeding in the eye, and you actually have to bring them down to a 6 or 4 week interval. And we can also predict such events.
Wow, that makes a lot more sense. So it's helping them early to plan out the protocol, but then over time to shift that and monitor it as needed.
Yes.
Where maybe that hasn't always been in place in the past, which is part of what has had people experience dropping off and not adhering to protocol. It seems like there's some complexity in it out of the gates, but also as it progresses, it's not just this is the protocol for the entirety of the process for the patient.
And I mean, it's a bit unfair for the doctors. I mean, the only possibility right now they have to see if the treatment works and how the patient responds is basically after 4 or 6 or 8 weeks, when the patient comes in for the next treatment, they will do a new imaging. And then they can basically say, okay, the last time we gave you a treatment, it worked and you responded well. So your macula, your retina is still dry. Let's continue and try maybe 10 weeks, but they will only know after 8 weeks. So they always basically titrate the right amount of treatment they need retrospectively. So we really turn this head over heels and say, okay, now it's prospectively, we can predict, not exactly, you should come back in 5.5 weeks, but we can say in which direction it's going and heading. What we call this, or medical co-founders call it, basically going from a treat and extend regimen, this trial and error, to a predict and treat.
Which I would think leads to much better adherence to protocol. Like I can see now how you mentioned the patient satisfaction point. And I was just reading about too. I mean, this isn't like a drug that you're just getting orally. This is a shot in your eye. So I can imagine this isn't like something that you want to be going in and be having a trial error experience on when you might not need it.
And I mean, what we can also show with this, this prediction is really especially meant for the patient communication, education. It can also be used when you consider switching a drug. When you have the feeling, the patient is not responding well. Typically, such decisions are made after a year of basically trying on a drug. With us, you can make such decisions much earlier to switch the patient to a, let's say, more potent or drug with a longer duration that possibly is either more expensive or has higher side effects. So you wouldn't start as a first line option. But if you see, okay, the prediction is going this way, the patient also demands to, go on a longer interval, then you might switch those patients now earlier than you did before. And this is really where you finally come to the personalized treatment regimen, and you also can, let's say, start to justify the enormous cost, the development costs, the billions of dollars we have put into those new treatments. But for the last 15, 20 years, there is not a single drug that has shown any superiority in their approval trials. So all of those new drugs, since the first drug was introduced in 2005, 2006, there hasn't been any basically advancement on the medical side regarding the efficacy. And that's why we say, well, we can, of course, dish another 10 billion in there over the next 10 years. And maybe, the duration will be slightly longer or something. But in the end, we should maybe not just, have a hammer like the life science companies have and see everything as a nail. Maybe we should look from the other side and say we need a process innovation to actually enable all those nice drugs that we have by now, not just a single one. Like 20 years ago, you had no choice. You had just one. Now you have 10, 15 drugs. Most of them are quite similar, but let's say 2 differences are still there. How do you use them? When do you use them? This is really, we want to provide the information to get to this personalized therapy and change those patient journeys and pathways. And basically, we build a blockbuster drug therapy that potentially could even show superiority and just at the cost of a software company.
You've recently gotten your CE approval last year. You just want to talk a little bit about that? I know the path to getting AI approved is one thing here in the US market with the FDA, and another thing with CE, just the path to that and what that was like and what that's led to now in terms of how it's changed your strategy and where you're at.
So as I mentioned before, like in 2022, we are trying a lot of things. We also joined a US accelerator program, which was very helpful and showed us there's a very clear market need and product market fit in the US for our solution. However, we also saw that contrary to what we mostly say nowadays, the FDA, at least regarding in our space, was much less open to, for instance, a prediction regarding a treatment response for ophthalmology. They really would have ranked us very, very high risk. In addition, of course, we had a data advantage in Europe. I mean, we have a global data set from Japan to the US, but there is center and the bulk of our real world clinical data of excellence, like showing really good outcomes over years, not just, 1 or 2 years as in RCTs, but really over up to 10, 15 years. This unique data, it's mostly sourced in Europe. And that's why in the end, we said, okay, we will still launch in Europe. And we have concentrated then. We raised a funding round in 2023, hired a team, got the regulatory expertise in-house and built it out so that we could, submit and get the approval mid of last year. And it is the first approval for predictive AI in ophthalmology. And it's also the first approval for an AI for the patient education part. And it's the first approval for an AI that provides a therapy decision support. All previous AIs in this space, which are out there for a couple of years already, were either focused on the screening aspect, so finding patients and then bring them to the eye doctor, or in a second step, there was a wave, let's say slightly ahead of us, where you had some diagnostic support. So you could look at an image and now the image wasn't black and white anymore, but you had some colored in areas and maybe there were some measurements provided on how much this colored area is. And we, of course, go 1 or 2 steps beyond that and say, there isn't just a colored area. We actually tell you what this means for your treatment decision. And we also let you know on how this might evolve in the future.
Wow. And then you've already in that also have a reimbursement pathway as well.
So this, of course, is the disadvantage of Europe. If I could, make a one wish, it's basically a harmonized reimbursement system in Europe. I know
Yeah.
in the US it's also not perfect from state to
No, it's
state.
definitely not.
Some differences, but still, in general, you have one single CPT code, and
Yeah.
this is, of course, something where we definitely see a big disadvantage in commercialization, and which is why we have always kept our link to the US. We have 2 US people on our team, 3 actually by now on our team. We have one based in the US. Last year, we made 50% of our revenue in the US with, pharma research projects. And the US is definitely for us still a very, very relevant market. We think also over time there have been some approvals that actually enable us now to do, let's say, approval for the US that doesn't cost us, 7 years and a prospective trial together with the pharma company as a companion diagnostic, but it is slightly more affordable and also from the time frame a bit more reasonable.
Yeah. And do you want to speak to that a little more? That seems like another revenue stream for you all of working with pharma companies and why that is attractive, like for them to work with you all.
So I think the pharma companies in our space, some of them, they have their own AI in-house capabilities. Some of them don't. Some had it, shut it down. But in the end, all of them are highly collaborative because the value lever that we can bring to them is enormous. I mean, it's not just about, imagine a pharma company. There were launches of 2 now blockbuster drugs already like 2 or 3 years ago, and they still have now maybe 7 years on patent. So you really have to imagine the pressure is high to really bring it into commercialization fast. And those drugs still remain, however, second or maybe even third line treatment option. So that's for them not ideal. They really want to make sure that the patients that benefit from those newer agents get on those agents as fast as possible. And on the other side, even, if there are some patients who don't really benefit, it's also not ideal for them to get the results from that. So it's really important for them what we do. And we have seen they also collaborate, of course, with other companies to try out, what help could it be to have a better screening process, to start a digital patient journey? What help could it be to have a better diagnostic reading in their own studies? I can say as an AI-based reading center, there are companies doing this offering. But what's really unique about us that we can help them, let's say, during the commercialization stage. So let's say phase 3, but latest phase 4 study and beyond, when they're in the market, to really make sure the drug is reaching those patients who need it the most and not the other way around.
And how did you think about that? I guess going into it too strategically, like, how you were looking at, because I'm sure, I feel like a lot of companies race to get out there to market, but it seems like the economics and the different incentives are aligned within you, even within the pharma companies, the patients. It's better for the insurance companies as well. Like, how were you thinking about that when you were involved early and strategically? And, how do you look at that in general, I guess?
Learnings from my previous as well as some other startups I worked with is definitely to stay vendor neutral as long as possible. So that's true on our software side. We have integrations and we are the only one actually who is basically device agnostic. We can work with most imaging devices on the market, more than 90% of those sold worldwide. And we can also integrate into all the major imaging software systems that are packaged with those devices. We also work with most of those companies as our distribution or go-to-market marketing partners. So they basically, scale the length of our own 1.5 FTE sales force quite a bit. The same is true on the pharma side.
1.5 FTE.
I'm the half FTE.
That's half CEO.
As a CEO, unfortunately, I have some other duties to take care of. I wish I could do a bit more on the sales side because I really like it. That's really when you get the brutally honest feedback on, if your product is already good enough or not for the doctor and convinces them. And on the other side, also what you still have to improve. So I'm really like to be, I wouldn't say, just a commercial CEO, but also with a strong product glasses on. In the end, if the product is good, the person will be convinced And then, everything else comes more easily, fundraising, etc. On the other side, you mentioned the pharma companies. So we also work not just with the device companies like Heidelberg Engineering, which is a world market leader in this space, and then Zeiss, and of course, Topcon Healthcare. But we also work on the pharma side with companies like, Novartis early on supported the research actually in the incubation of this company. Then later on, companies like Roche, Bayer in the US now, companies like Astellas Pharma. And this is really helpful for us to get their feedback, their market view. But in the end, still provide a solution that is independent from what they would develop on their own. So I think, can really show to doctors, we are not in this camp or that camp. In the end, we just want you to make, as a doctor, the best decision. We don't care in the end which treatment you choose. And in the future, this can even go beyond anti-VEGFs or injections. This can be for other retinal conditions, lasers. This could be, vitrectomies, which is some kind of surgery, or corticosteroids. In the end, we just want to provide the information so that the doctor can make the right decision at the right time and do this in a very efficient manner that even saves them time, not just making the decision, but also the documentation.
Yeah, I see that, as you can be agnostic, which actually makes you more trustworthy too. I feel like that is truly the case, that you're not, that you can come in there and just be looking at what the best outcome is for the patients. But I like that you still like to get out there in the field. I think that's important as a stage that you're at too, as a CEO, to get out there and be out there in the sales. So how did you make that decision to go through distribution channels as opposed to going direct? I think that's always something to think about as you come to commercialization for early stage. Like, how are we going to get this out there? And it seems like you've made it so it's been pretty seamless for clinicians to integrate this into their practice, which I think is another big hurdle often that comes up. It's like you have another AI programmer or software, but then they have to get something else, and then does this integrate into their system? And there's all these different things. But it seems like you've made it very easeful, and just, talk more about that.
So it's definitely learning, again, also from previous startups, for myself, as well as from the CTO. In my previous company, we did a lot of direct sales in Germany, Europe, while then in the US going through distribution partner, which was much more successful actually in the end, with all the local market knowledge, the sales power, etc. What we've also seen is that more and more in the imaging space, you see those, let's say, marketplace models, usually owned by the OEMs. Sometimes you have a vendor neutral solution, but usually the access to the imaging is basically, there's a gatekeeper, which is the OEM. MRI, CT spaces might be the Philips, Siemens, GEs of this world. In our case, we saw that Heidelberg was just launching their Epway, Topcon with their cloud-based Harmony solution. They also had the integrations, and also Zeiss is heading in this direction. And they even, hired somebody who did this before from Philips, actually. So it's really, you can see the strategy was already heading this way. That's why I would also say, timing is always crucial for a startup. What we do now wouldn't have been possible 4 or 5 years ago. Companies who started out 4 or 5 years ago, they had to develop their own imaging software first to then, in this own imaging software, build their AI. And some of them have done it rather successfully, but of course, they will never have the clinical base that, the other 3 vendors who basically cover 90% plus of the market have already. And that's why for us, the partnering approach is really central. And we really try to be as interoperable with everything. And the next step is, of course, to go also beyond the imaging system and directly push the information that we have from our analytics back also into the EMR systems and the patient file.
On that note, what is next for you all? Manuel, what do you see as like,
what's next?
You got CE approval, you have a distribution strategy, you're in Europe, what is it? New markets entering into Europe, and, strategy. 100%. What would, you looking in, 2-3 years from now, what would be like your dream?
So last year, we went from, we had our first trade shows with a booth. Before, we were often invited as speakers, but not really, having a booth at a trade show. And now last year we went from, I think in March, the first trade show, to Who is Deep Eye, to another conference in September, where people were stopped by the booth and said, I've heard about you now in 12 or 14 talks at this conference. There seems to be something about you. Of course, I've heard about Deep Eye. I want to know more. So I would say in Germany, we definitely have the market awareness now. And we also, I would say, are number one already regarding the number of AI analytics. In the first 6 months, we almost did 15,000 AI supported injections, you can say. And this is really, what we want to grow now tenfold. For this, we will grow first, of course, in Germany, but we will also grow in neighboring countries. We have now the first clinics going live in Switzerland and the Netherlands. And with fresh funding, we wish also to, basically drive it out over the continent, also run more studies. I mean, we just did a recent study which showed for the first time ever that an AI in ophthalmology can provide a functional benefit to a patient, which means basically, if a doctor and our AI are in agreement versus if the AI and the doctor are not in a disagreement, we see there is a huge functional difference. And this is really, a big impact. What we of course have to do is look at this prospectively. And this is something we can only do now that we are approved in the market. And again, something which we look for funding. I mean, we have a pretty good runway and low burn rate, but if we want to run prospective studies, it's something, additional funding would help us there, as well as for the marketing commercialization efforts. And last but not least, we want to launch 2 new products that we have already developed as prototypes here in Europe, as well as another product which is more targeted towards the US market, requires more regulatory and development power. Again, this is where we would like to acquire additional funding. And we're actually right now raising a second financing round to do this next market step. And then by the end of the year, have at least a 10x on the AI analytics that we provide. And we always have this big vision of by 2030 having around, preserved 1 million people from blindness. And to make the math, going back to the engineering side, this means roughly supporting 40 million-ish OCT analytics per year as an AI second opinion for eye doctors worldwide.
Wow. Yeah. And it's not, what excites me about where you're at is it's not just theory. You're actually doing it now. You have a reimbursement pathway, you have approval, and now it's just about expansion, different markets. Obviously, you have some new products coming out as well. And plus just a deep library of images that you can draw upon from all these years. It's not like you need to train the model in terms of from an image perspective. I'm sure you just got a deep well of images and a network there and a strategy for marketing and sales as well. That's not going to burn through a lot of capital.
Yeah. Maybe just one thing to clarify. I mean, we are, I don't know if the only, but definitely one of the few companies in our space. We actually don't keep the data from our customers. So if you're paying customer, we say, you already paid with your money. You don't have to pay with your data. We actually delete the imaging from every customer. So basically after 60 seconds, that's the time that we need, the image is deleted. On the other side, we are working and collaborating and inviting everyone to become a data donor. This can be a customer, but doesn't have to be. So we have data donors now in multiple countries who actually provided us, with data from, as I say, Japan, Switzerland, Germany, doesn't matter, to really make sure that we have this longitudinal data on treatment. So it's not just the imaging, but it's included with like how was actually the outcome of the treatment and how did it develop over time. So most of those patients we can really follow for a couple of years. And this is something which you rarely get because most data sets out there, they are maybe 1 or 2 years maximum because first of all, you have high dropout rates in real world. And on the other side, typically a pharma or randomized controlled trial is only 1 or 2 years long. And that's basically how you acquired those imaging in the past. And this is why, it's also not very easy to copy us because if somebody wants to build such a longitudinal data set, they basically start out now and have to do it for the next 10 years to be where we are right now.
Wow. There's a moat around you and your business model to some extent.
The data moat, and we are expanding the clinical evidence moat. No other AI company has shown any functional benefit, of their solution on the patient and on the treatment outcome. This is really something which for others will take a couple of years to catch up because again, the study, when they start the same study that we did now, we already have started the next study.
Yeah. No, I'm excited to watch the journey and kind of what's next for you all there at DeepEye and for what that brings forward in terms of new advanced technologies out there and what you come out with next. So any advice that you have for young or not even always young, but people making the transition potentially from the onto the dark side from the business world, whether that's from engineering to make it, or in just startup world in general, and especially within the AI perspective, because I feel like there's a lot of new technologies coming out there, but you've commercialized something and brought it to market. So just any advice that you have, and how you would approach it.
Yeah, of course, come to the dark side. All scientists, all engineers, the dark side, we have cookies. No, I mean,
Yeah,
I mean, what's for us really, or for me, always very enlightening is, don't listen too much to any other advice. You have to do it. And I think this is really for me why I like to work in a startup. In the end, you can't bullshit yourself, because I mean, if something fails, it fails because of you. You can say, well, it was a market. Who chose the market? It was us. It was, the product wasn't good enough. Well, who built the product? It was us. So this is something, you have a very steep learning curve, and is going way beyond anything you can learn, whatever in strategy consulting or university or in your PhD. It's really, really cool to try to execute on the brilliant ideas that, all those people have. And to be quite honest, I'm not the person with the brilliant ideas. This is really, in this case, the doctors and the eye people who sat together, sketched out on a napkin in 2018 how this could work out. I mean, I would say they are the creative genius. But in the end, the journey from there is already a couple of years, and we are still not done to really bring it and roll it out globally. So this is really when you see how to adapt to those changes in the plan. What for me at least drives the big learning, and what I'm really happy and looking forward to repeat maybe a couple of, one or two more times before my career runs out.
Yeah, and on that note, I mean, you said you were so excited to join here. I'm sure there had to be aspects beyond just the technology. I feel like a team is really important, and how do you look at that, or how did you assess that in making your choice to join?
So as I said, I mean, in the previous startup, there was a medical doctor. Back then it was a trauma surgeon orthopedist who had a problem which he encountered regularly. There was no solution available on the market. So he basically, put some stuff together, 3D printed some braces, and, even served some patients that otherwise couldn't have been helped. But it was definitely not something, scalable. And this time around, again, there was a group of ophthalmologists, as I found out, actually quite known retina specialists that are, I think, number 3 or 4 in those public rankings here in Germany regarding, clinical studies. They really drive this innovation. For me, having clinicians on the ground who don't just, give you feedback, but also you really help you conceptualize the entire thing, test it out, also refer you to other ophthalmologists who give you then again their feedback, which might be different, but in the end still, is very helpful early on, but still now. This is something which clear prerequisite for any other founding I will do maybe in the coming years. Having some, hands-on clinicians on board is super helpful, and goes way beyond, what I could do as a medical engineer, despite having been, in lots of ORs and seen set into 100 or 200 patient conversations, listening to them, always asking the same questions. What's going to happen next with me? Will it ever stop? No, it's a chronic condition. Okay, how often do I have to come back? Can I do my vacation, summer vacation? And this is, really where DeepI came in. But for them, they experience it not just like me 200 times, they experience thousands of times, every day, a couple of times. So that's really what I think is really helpful for any founder, to have such people on the team.
Yeah, that's really key. Just a wide breadth of experience, it sounds like you've got on your team, with this clinical support on the ground there to get real world feedback right away. That's part of the team. That's within that space. It's super exciting to hear where you go. I really appreciate your time, and yeah, come to the dark side, people. It's not that bad. It can be fun to learn from real world experience, to get out of the lab into the world, create your own companies. And yeah, Manuel, I'm excited to continue to follow what you all got going on there at DeepI. I feel like people that are thinking about stepping into creating new technologies with imaging and AI could definitely learn something from the approach that you all have taken. And I'm excited to see where you all take it next. And in the end, you're benefiting a lot of patients out there that obviously are suffering right now from these disease states, and this helps them get better treatment. So thank you for what you're doing.
Thank you, Christopher. And as you say, I mean, in the end, if we all get 150 years old, we will all have those retinal conditions. The older we get, the more likely it is. And, the only actually disability we are all going to face is blindness. And therefore is really a big topic. Just ask around in your family, check with them. I'm pretty sure, almost every listener here has somebody in the family who actually gets those injections or is close to getting those because they have a retinal disease. Maybe, they already had a cataract surgery, but now, the retina is growing old. It was just, let's say, evolutionary made to last 50, 55 years. We are now getting much older and we have to cope with it. And hopefully DeepEye is part of making a more personalized treatment available that also results in better outcomes for all those people in the future.
Yeah, I didn't think about that. There's a lot of talk about longevity treatment, and I'm super into that. But what about the longevity of the eye? Well, thank you, DeepEye, for solving that. I mean, I noticed crossing the 40 mark that something's changing with how my visualization is operating. So if you all can help with that as we get older, yeah, thank you. And just like you said, no one can get into the space that you're in as quickly. You're starting a precedent and a data set that's going to be really helpful as we continue to age and get older and make these new drugs that may come out more effective. Thank you. And on that note, where do people find you all and how can they learn more about, DeepEye and what you guys got coming out next?
So, of course, on our website, www.deepeye, which is deep and then I as one word, -medical.com, or on LinkedIn as well as myself. I'm also active on LinkedIn. Just, connect. Let me know what you're looking for. That's, of course, very helpful. That'll put you in the right box and potentially, I can connect you to somebody or the other way around. I'm always happy to learn from people who have experience in this area, maybe in other markets, areas that we haven't looked into, to learn and find out more what we could do in the future.
You've been listening to Stories in Life Sciences, sponsored by MedAccess AI, where we explore people, ideas, and breakthroughs shaping the future of biotech and healthcare innovation. To learn more, visit medaccessai.org and subscribe on YouTube to watch the full conversations and new episodes as they launch. I'm Christopher Wilson. Thanks for joining us. Until next time, keep shaping the future one story at a time.